All right, so this demonstration is going to be broken up into several videos. And this first video, we're going to cover talking about 3D lights inside of the Blender interface. So again, make sure that you have your 3D scene loaded and open back into Blender so that you can follow along with your own work, or you're welcome to practice along with the demonstration. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my file back into Blender. So I'm going to go to File, Open, locate my project on the desktop, and open it up. All right. So just as a refresher, last time we looked at a lot of different things actually. We looked at a lot of ways to be able to create alternative model forms inside of Blender. We looked a lot at how to use some of the special objects from the Add menu, like metaballs, surfaces, and curves, to create kind of unique or abstract kind of forms. We also looked at some of the different modes that we could use in Blender from the lower 3D menu to also do additional editing. So we looked at things like sculpt mode for really organic kind of editing, like a sculptor would do with carving into a model, pulling pieces out of it, and reshaping it. We also looked at edit mode for kind of fine detailed editing. So grabbing, deleting, or moving around vertices or faces of your design. So a lot of high detail editing we could do in that area. And then the last thing that we looked at was something called modifiers. And modifiers we could find in our property panel by going to the little blue wrench icon on the right side of the screen. And that would just give us access to some of the other filtering tools for 3D modeling. And that's what we looked at in the last exercise. So what I want to look at today, specifically starting, is working with 3D lights. So actually shaping the lighting of your scene. So we'll look at some of the different lights that are related to that and how to tweak them to properly light your model on the cyclorama. So let's get started with that part. All right. So in our base model design, dropping in your character with the cyclorama, any standard Blender scene comes paired with two other objects in the scene. Both of them, if I kind of navigate to them for a second for you, both of them are positioned off screen a little bit. So one of them is this little circular dotted point. This is your light source inside of Blender. At least it's your current light source. Oh, and by the way, if you have not altered your mouse settings in Blender, this would be a good time to do that. Or on the computer. I forgot to do that at the beginning, so I'm just going to real quick slide into System Preferences on the computer and change my mouse settings. Always make sure that you have some of these buttons activated, like the one, you should have a right mouse button, so that should be secondary. And your mouse wheel you can set to button 3. That actually gives you some special viewport orbiting capability inside of Blender that you don't normally get when you assign these 3 buttons correctly. So that's just handy to make it easier to navigate and select objects. All right, I'm going to close out this window. And I might change one more setting while I'm inside of Blender. So I'm going to go to File, User Preferences, and you can change this whether or not it suits your ability. It's up to you. But where it says Select With over here under the Input category, I usually set it to left because that's more natural. We always select with left on a mouse on the computer. So I'm just changing mine to left. Hit save the user setting and close that window as well. All right, so now I should be able to select items while I left. There we go, yeah, perfect. All right. So So this is what your light source looks like inside of Blender. It's just this funky little dot inside your screen. And if you have it highlighted, it turns orange, obviously, just like anything else in Blender when you highlight it or select it. But this little light source is a basic light in here. And again, you kind of get an idea of how it works somewhat. This light has a little line that extends down from it. Most light sources have a line that extend from them in some way to indicate where the ground plane is in the scene. So it lowers straight down to it. But the interesting thing is if we want to see the effect of the light in the scene, let's change our shader mode down below. So where you see the little white sphere on your lower menu bar, click on it. And let's go to Material. And when you go to Material, this actually gives you an in-screen preview of what the light is doing in the scene. It's even giving you a little bit of what the shadowing is doing on the character or any other surrounding objects. The cool thing is we can move around our light source inside our scene while we're in here. Now bear in mind, my scene is open with the quad view. If you don't, it'll make it really kind of hard to navigate this thing. So I do recommend having quad view turned on. If you don't remember how to do that, just go to View at the bottom and go up to Toggle Quad View. And that'll break your screen into 4 sections. But I'm just kind of dragging the light around here in the top view so that you can kind of see how it changes the effect of lighting on your object in your scene. And this is just based on one light source, so you can see where it's casting shadows, where it's casting highlights on the cyclorama. Part of the reason the cyclorama is actually showing any highlights at all is because the surface material has a little bit of a shine to it. Otherwise, it would just appear kind of white all over. All right. So that's what the light kind of does inside the scene. Again, if you change its position with your little 3D widget that pops up on it, you can change how it lights the scene. Obviously, raising it higher will light the model from above as opposed to midway down. And that changes the effect of how the light appears on the subject. Now, this is the very basic light in Blender. This is called an area light. So it kind of works like a light bulb, is what you can think of it as. It's like an exposed light bulb or incandescent light bulb is the basic effect of it. If we want to check out how to manipulate this light source, we can go over to our property panel over on the right. So I'm just going to pull out my property panel over here. And under the property panel, where that little row of icons are, there should be a special icon listed there for your light now that the light is selected. And it looks just like this sort of crazy yellow dot with little arrows pointing away from its center. That's your light property. So let's click on that and view some light properties. All right, I'm going to bring this menu up a little bit so you can see it. Okay, so in the light box, in the light menu, it gives you a couple things. First, it gives you a preview of what your light source settings look like on sort of a standardized background to sort of show you how it lights a space or a shape. Down below that, it gives you details about how to modify the light source. Cool thing is, in Blender, you can actually convert any light source that you currently have in the scene to an alternate light tool inside of Blender. So the basic one we have on is the point light, which another word for it is also sometimes area, but point light. Sunlight, if you click on that, it will switch your light to becoming like the sun. So it actually is more of an environmental light source. No matter where you move the light in the scene, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the way the light affects the scene. But what changes sunlight is actually its direction on the horizon, which is dictated by this dotted line that extends out from it in your viewport. So if I was to rotate my light source, so I'm going to come over here in my front viewport, and I'm going to hit the R key while I'm over here to activate rotate. As I move the sun with rotate, notice how it changes the casted shadow. So this is how the sun tool works specifically. So it's just kind of dictating how light is cast inside of a scene overall, and it affects all model structures, so shadows cast onto each other, onto other objects, and so on. But that's how the sun source works. So it's a very natural, broad spectrum light source inside of your scene. Now, for the most part with your modeling, you'll probably just be sticking with probably spotlights or point lights for your design. So let's look at the next one, spot. Now again, spot is also a directional light source. Like the sun, it has to aim in a certain direction to light its subject. It is like a stage can light, if you're familiar with those. So it does cast a circular arc about its environment. And the quality of this light is very different than the sun in that if you move it, the light source does get darker as you move away. This is actually called fall off, is the technical term for light as it disappears into the distance and your shape falls into shadow. That's called light fall off. But it's a very unique source in the sense that you can easily sort of shape the scene around your character or shape light on one side based on a cone-shaped kind of expression of light. So that's working with the spotlight. The other lights I'm really not going to play with. There's one here for hemispheric light, which is kind of like the sun. And then the area light, you actually have to use like in tandem with other options in Blender to make it work properly. So I really just want to focus on looking at spot and point. So I'm going to start with point and show you some properties here that you can change. So down below, after you've selected the light source, they have a white strip bar. That white strip actually indicates the color that the light source gives off. So standard is white, but you can click on it and change it to whatever tone you want. The closer your selection is to the center of the color wheel, the more it is a mix of white, more of a sort of transparent use of light, so it's a very weakened color or saturation of color. Typically in the real world, we would use like what's called a color gel over the front of a light source if you're in a studio setting or a stage setting. So this works in a similar fashion to that, where you can kind of change lighting color. You also have this vertical bar on the side that changes the power of the light source in the sense of light and darkness that it casts into the scene. We can also control that from another option outside of this though. Alright, so that's changing color with the color bar. Below that is the power level of the light source, so that's called energy. And if I take my energy level down, the light becomes very, very weak. So we can actually use it to do more subtle lighting in our scene if we need a light that's not quite as powerful as the others. We tend to call that like a fill light whenever you're lighting a subject. So that's kind of the less powerful light source. But that's what energy does, is that controls power, output for the light. The rest of the settings inside there I'm not going to really go over. Those are just the two main ones to know about inside this first section for point lighting. If you look down below the actual lamp settings, there's shadow settings. So you can actually tell your light to cast shadows if it's possible for the light source to cast shadows. With a hemispheric light, with a point-based light, sometimes it's a little more tricky to cast a shadow into the scene. As right now, it's set with blue on what's called ray trace shadowing, which is supposed to be more realistic shadow application. And the shadow color is set to black, which is this black bar. And then it gives you some options down at the bottom for how to play with your shadow settings. So you have like samples and you have soft sizes. And the more that you change those, the more amped up the shadow will become in the scene eventually. Excuse me. Let me see if I can remember how to do this. So, and if it'll preview it inside the material window. Sometimes shadow previews you will not see unless you switch your shader to rendered. And there we are, yeah. So when I switched it to rendered, it now actually casts the full shadow into my scene from the light source. It's just that some shadows can't be generated automatically using the standard shader. So sometimes you have to use the full screen preview to make it happen. And that's what we're seeing right here. All right, so that's using rendered. I'm going to go back to material here. All right, so that's adjustments that you can make for the basic point lighting system. If you hop over to the spot, so I'm just going to click on spot to switch my light source, and I'm going to move my light to where I can see my subject. Again, this is where coordinating with all 4 viewports is very important. If you're just trying to move around a light with one little viewport, it's going to get very messy and very hard to know how to point this thing at the right object in the scene. Right now, again, we're previewing everything in material mode, so if it makes it easier to see where the light is, you can switch back to solid shading mode and then get your light to aim at your subject using like the R key in various windows to rearrange its position in the scene. And then you can switch back and go back to material shader. All right. So for a spotlight, the settings are not all that different from a point light. You still have color, energy, level you can set. You can set the fall off level for the lighting right here where it says inverse square and it gives you a distance. If you change that, if you lower the distance, it will shrink the light source to where the light becomes less and less powerful and the fall off becomes greater as it moves away. And you can also see how the cone shrinks away from the subject as I make the number for distance smaller. So that's just its way of visualizing that light falls off faster as that distance number becomes smaller. And then down below for shadow settings, you have several options, like you can use a temporary buffer shadow, or you can use the ray trace shadow, which is more accurate. And then it still gives you the other settings like sampling you can still adjust, which again probably look better when you watch in the render shader instead of the material. And then down below for point light, we also get to change its shape a little bit because it is a shaped light source. We can change its size, so we can make it a greater degree or smaller degree cone for a more honed point level of light. We can change its blend for how soft or how sharp the light source is. And then you also get checkboxes down here for like square if you want to have more of a square casting light source as opposed to a round one in your scene. Or you can actually visibly show the cone inside your scene so you know where it's casting light into your scene. So that can sometimes be helpful to have that turned on just for that aspect. And obviously it doesn't render the cone when you go to the render port. All right. So let me go back to material, turn off show cone. And the other thing we want to do when we're playing with lights, besides just knowing how to change them and how to kind of move them around, again, with something like Spot, you have to be used to the idea that you're going to have to rotate it a lot because it only points in one direction at a time. And so you can switch that. It's not too bad if you're switching. If you've got it at the right height you want it at, then just using like the top view to rotate is pretty easy. Now, besides using one light source, we can duplicate and add more lights to our scene at any time. Again, to kind of better shape our model. And it's actually more effective to light it that way when you have to look at it from more than one angle. So I'm just going to show you like a basic lighting setup real fast of how to do that. So I'm going to switch to a point light. And I'm going to move, whoops, not my cyclorama. Grab my light source. And I'm going to put it around my subject. And I'm using top view to kind of coordinate. I do sometimes use the front view to make sure I know what height the light is set to, like how high it is compared to my model. Usually you want to kind of keep it kind of up towards like the top, near the top of it, to where its head is not a bad spot. Unless you're kind of bouncing around and having like an overhead light and lower lights. But I'm going to put a bunch of them at this level. So I'm going to get it positioned about this high in my front view compared to my model. And in my top view is where I'm going to do all the duplicating and moving, so they all stay at the same level. So in my top view, I'm going to get my light kind of nearby my model. And to duplicate anything in here, you just hit Shift D and then move your mouse, and that will pull out a copy of whatever you had selected on screen. And so what I'm going to do is just take this light and copy it and move it around my model, again, just to create kind of a simple light structure around the model. Now I'm going to take it out of quad view for a second too. And when you enable the middle mouse pointer option in your system preferences, you can click and drag on your middle mouse button or your scroll wheel. You can just click on it and hold it down, and you can drag your scene around. And that's kind of really handy. But you can quickly see how it's lit the model around the sides and what it's done as far as lighting is concerned. And this is pretty handy. Again, it's just for lighting your model so you can see it from different standard viewing angles, which you're going to create later when we do the finishing exercise for the project. But this is just to get it rigged so you can light it. Now again, you can have a lot of fun with playing with the lighting as well. Like, not all lights have to be at the same height necessarily. But you do want to make sure that it's well lit from all four sides in some way whenever we make the final output images of your work, so that we kind of get the shape of the model and what it appears to be. All right. So again, you may want to switch it up. You can use multiple light sources. You can switch out lights. They don't all have to be exactly the same. Maybe one of them needs to be a spotlight source instead of a point light. If you go into the render shader, this will preview what it's going to look like on output. Now, the render port menu is not like 100% awesome because the computer is not, and Blender and 3D software will leverage a lot of memory and a lot of graphic RAM. So it doesn't preview very fast when you have like lights and stuff all queued up in a scene. It takes time for it. That's why when I scroll in like this, it gets all pixelated initially, and then it sort of softens out the render after a few passes. But that's what you're seeing happening. But you get an accurate view of what light is doing to your model in the scene. So again, work with the model and set it up to where it's well lit around all sides. Again, you can play with dramatic lighting or whatever, but just make sure that we can see different features from all the different sides of it, okay? Too much heavy shadowed dramatic lighting makes it to where we can't even tell what we're looking at. And we want to make sure we know what we're looking at. All right. So that's basically playing around with lights. Again, working with them in here, it's important that you are balancing out use of lighting, multiple lights, playing around with their properties in the property panel, and using your different 4-angle viewport to really move things around accurately. For a lot of stuff that we do in here, using those 4-port windows can be huge for accurately repositioning things. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop this particular video for lighting, and then we're going to start one on working with the 3D camera next.